King Charles III is being coronated. He was born in 1720. How's he still... That's right. Wrong time period. I hate this thing anyway. Stay tuned. We're going to talk about the last King Charles. King Charles II. I do not like wearing wigs. I'm just going to put that out there. I like my hair. I don't like that hair. Our story begins May 29th, 1630, at St. James's Palace in London. His mother was Henrietta Marie, sister of Louis XIII. His father was King Charles I. He was the second child. The first died within the first day of its life. His godparents were Louis XIII, his uncle, and his grandmother, Maria de Medici. Understanding Charles II is one of the most crucial things to understanding this time period. Golden Age of Pirates in general. You see a lot of reference back to Charles II, if not the Stuarts as a whole. By the time of the English Civil Wars, Charles II was a teenager. In 1649, Charles I was beheaded. The family learned about this while they were on the run. His sister Elizabeth died the same year of pneumonia on the Isle of Wight, where she was being held. She was described as a sad girl before she died. Almost immediately after the death of his father, Charles released the Treaty of Breda. It was hoped that there would be risings in Scotland and England by loyalist forces. Surprisingly, unsurprisingly, depending on how you look at it, the Scottish responded favorably. He was declared King of Scotland right after the death of his father in 1649. Scotland had been an independent country up until James I. There were several wars, there were several attempts to bring Scotland under English control. When Queen Elizabeth I was expected to be childless, a treaty had been arranged that James I, then a small child, would take over upon her death. He did. There was a lot of fear in England that Scotland was taking over. Today there's this stereotype that Scotland was almost like the hillbillies of the British Isles. That is far from the truth. The Scottish and Irish both, because of their strained relationship with England, often found themselves going to the continent for learning, for military experience. Many of those who were wealthier would send their children to school in Europe. This goes all the way back through William Wallace, even. They were not isolated. Scotland and Ireland, maybe even to a greater extent than England itself, were much more in touch with the Renaissance. As we're heading into the Baroque era, it was Charles I and later his son who introduced Baroque art to England. England, to a certain degree, was a backwater. Yes, they defeated the Spanish Armada. Yes, privateers had been attacking in South America. But they were not taken as seriously as such nations as France, as Spain, even the Dutch. A lot of their views tend to be backward. Even within England itself, there were many people who felt the Anglican Church had not gone far enough. I'm going to probably do a video on religion in this I am almost certainly going to do a video on religion in this time period with a focus on the British Isles. It's important to understand, though, when we're talking about radical Christians, we are not talking in a modern sense. Many of these groups who had been labeled as radicals were pushing for such things as abolition, freedom of religion, freedom of speech. Sounds a little bit familiar, doesn't it? A good chunk of the English Civil War was religious-based. In June of 1650, Charles II arrived in Scotland. On the 1st of January, 1651, Charles II was coronated for the first time at Scone Palace in Perth. In July of the preceding year, 1650, the Anglo-Scottish War began. Now, I'm not going to go too in-depth on it. It's not as relevant to our era specifically. However, in short, England invaded Scotland, Scotland invaded England. The Battle of Worcester occurred September 1651. It was a Scottish defeat. Charles II fled from England. There's many accounts of him disguising himself as a woman. There are accounts of him disguising himself as a poor person. He was 6 feet tall. He was very noticeable due to the artwork, putting people's faces on coins. It was very obvious who he was. Charles and his brother James remain in Europe during this time period. They served at various points with the French, with the Dutch. They were relatives of royalty on the continent. They were related to both the Bourbons in France and the Orange in the Dutch Republic. They had a place to go, but they naturally were not happy. September 3rd, 1658, Oliver Cromwell died. Cromwell, by this point, had consolidated Ireland, Scotland, and England, and had brought about, it's called a commonwealth, but to a greater extent, it was almost a military dictatorship. I say almost. Parliament was supposedly in charge, but as Lord Protector, Cromwell was in charge. His son, Richard Cromwell, took power, creating what would have been a dynasty. Richard Cromwell, from the outset, had no idea what he was doing. There's nothing to be fair about on him. He didn't have the same social skills as his father. He did not have the same political skills as his father. He lacked military skills. He did not have the same charisma as his father. 25th of May, 1659, Richard leaves. Richard ends up spending the bulk of his life running around Europe, afraid that he's going to be assassinated. In truth, he probably could have returned at any point in time. Nobody was really looking for him that much. I know some will be able... They had to have been. He was hanging out, he was brushing shoulders with some of the wealthiest people in Europe. They knew who he was. The Rump Parliament was recalled. George Monk, then Governor of Scotland, forced Parliament to recall the Long Parliament. Yes, there's a lot of political infighting at this point in time. George Monk realized that nobody could lead effectively as Cromwell had done as James I had done. He made the right decision to, let's bring back the old Parliament and see what we can do here. The 1660 Declaration of Breda called for religious freedom, back pay for the army, and a general pardon, except for 50 people. Parliament decides to, we're not going to give you any conditions. We are going to say that you have been king since the death of your father. We're just going to pretend this last few years never happened, but nothing happened. We're good, right? We're good? Charles set his arrival to coincide with his birthday. The entire trip through London took 7 hours. Now, you'd think that given the circumstances he would be coronated immediately. Coronation's like the official process. Like, yes, you're king, but this is the ritual that goes with it. They had to wait roughly another year for the coronation, as part of the Civil War they kind of melted down all the regalia. Yeah, they had to redo that. 9 people would be executed. Another 3, who were already dead, would be posthumously executed. That would be the best way to describe it. They were, of course, Oliver Cromwell. Can't forget him. Henry Ireton signed the death warrant for Charles I. And John Bradshaw, the judge who sentenced Charles I. The 3 had their bodies removed, their heads removed, and their heads put on pikes. Charles II accepted a £1.2 million annual income to run the government. It wouldn't be enough. The same year, his brother and sister, Henry and Mary, were both dead of smallpox. Mary being the mother of William III. He's going to be important later. There was the issue of Charles II needed a wife. Catherine of Braganza was decided. She was Portuguese, therefore Catholic. I was going to have a problem with that, right? Yeah. When we talk about a lot of folks in the past, there's always this assumption, unless explicitly stated, that they were religious. Charles II was not. Some of the first things Charles II did was bring back the theater. He also allowed women on the stage. Before that, when they had female characters, they were played by men. Having women on the stage was seen as horrifying. Everything was great. Charles II lived to a ripe old age. Everybody lived happily ever after. Of course not. 1665, the Great Plague of London occurred. There are different estimates, but thousands upon thousands of people died of plague. In recent years, there's been a lot more research onto bubonic plague and how it spread through Europe. Most studies now seem to hint that it was actually caused by lice and fleas, not by rats. Like, we're talking human lice and fleas, body lice specifically. The textile industry were some of the first people hit with it. And even at that point in time, they recognized that textiles might have been the source. There was a huge market for secondhand clothing. We'll probably discuss this at a later date when we talk more about clothes in general. But clothes would either be repurposed, used as is, but they usually would go through a tailor again, just to get them looking nice. Plague cleared up within a year, even though there was a large amount of life lost, they still managed to get ahead of it. And then September 2nd, 1666, the next year, the Great Fire of London occurred. Yeah, Charles was just not having a good time. The Great Fire of London, in a way, helped London. It would have been recognizable to somebody who time traveled from the beginning of the 1400s to the end of the 1500s. It would have been still recognizable. The Great Fire of London allowed Charles II to rebuild London. It also allowed an architect named Sir Christopher Wren to enter the stage. Sir Christopher Wren almost single-handedly brought the Baroque to England. Baroque builds upon the Renaissance. It makes it a new thing, based on a Portuguese word which means imperfect pearl. You saw architecture climb to new heights that you could only have dreamed of in the Renaissance. A lot of building techniques that had been started in the Renaissance, they flourished. But you also start to see a lot of kitsch, where architects will just throw random features together. It looks classical, but what is that? Wren doesn't do that. Wren's architecture is crisp. He's a Baroque architect, but there's a lot more. He feels much more Renaissance in his approach. Clean lines, but yet monumental. And of course, during this time, Charles II decides he wants to go to war with the Dutch. As you know from the Pennsylvania video, that was 3 times he went to war with the Dutch. It was costly. At one point, the English fleet was either destroyed or captured at the mouth of the Thames. It was not a good time to be a sailor in the Navy. Well, actually, I hope all of you realize it was never really a good time to be a sailor in the Navy unless you were a pirate. And then it was about 50-50. In 1670, Charles II signs the Treaty of Dover with the French. See, Parliament was not giving him more money to fight these wars. They were unpopular wars. Eventually, the Dutch would concede some of their northern territories, which we got into in the Pennsylvania video. I'm not going to go over it again. The British didn't get much for it, and they lost. I think the Dutch were kind of, here, take this, leave us alone. Charles wanted the lucrative trade in Asia, in the Caribbean. He wanted more of that money so he could keep building, so he could fund more arts, build on the prestige of England, and have multiple known and probably plenty more unknown affairs. This will become important later. He and his wife never had children. As we get later and later in his reign, he was 30, keep that in mind, when he came to power in 1660. The English government is realizing, the English people are realizing, that there's a very good chance that his brother will become king if he doesn't have children. Legitimate children. He had plenty of illegitimate children. James II was Catholic. Well, the 1670 Treaty of Dover, it was rumored, and later confirmed, but at the time it was just a rumor, that part of it would be Charles would eventually convert to Catholicism. And it made sense. The Catholics had helped him escape. The Catholics had been very crucial in the Loyalist cause. keep in mind that there had been immense Catholic persecution since Henry VIII. When people talk about Charles I trying to be an absolute monarch, when people will later talk about Charles II and James II trying to be absolute monarchs, they're skipping why they're trying to be absolute monarchs. In many cases, they were trying to push religious freedom through. You think about Maryland, you think about Pennsylvania. These areas were set up specifically for religious freedom. Going back to James I, part of his dialogue on witchcraft. Now, growing up with post the New Age movement, I often heard of like James I was a witch hunter and all these different things. James I, when he wrote about witchcraft, he wrote about approaching it logically. His conclusion was essentially, a lot of this witchcraft stuff isn't true. Doesn't make sense. Doesn't pass the smell test. Therefore, a lot of these people aren't witches. We need to leave them alone. Even though awful things happened as a result of his work, he was not in support of it. We're going to go back to this point where, yes, Parliament was pro-democracy. There are no good guys in the 17th century. In 1672, Charles has the Declaration of Indulgences. It's religious freedom for all. And decides to have another war with the Dutch because one wasn't enough. Even at this point, I've actually lost track if that was the second or the first one. We'll just let this be. It's not important at this point. Parliament refused to grant him any more money for it. Again, until the act was removed. He removed the act, the war was already done, it was pointless. 1673, the Test Acts were passed. Parliament wanted to make sure that nonconformists and Catholics would not get into power. In 1674, the condition of the Treaty of Dover was leaked. The Treaty of Westminster ending the war was signed almost immediately. The fears of James II becoming king grew stronger. In 1678, Titus Oates had convinced a man, we're pretty sure the man did not have full intellectual capacity, convinced him to go before Parliament and tell of a plot. And then Titus Oates, well, I know this plot too. It led to 22 people being executed, Catholics. The Popeish Plot, the persecution, it lasted until 1681. In that time, an amendment to the Test Acts were passed, making sure Catholics would have no power at all. There were murders elsewhere in England because there was a Catholic conspiracy. The Pope was trying to take over. It turned out that Titus Oates had, in fact, lied. I know, shocker. People in the past making up stories to pass laws. I do want to skip ahead, though, because James II had an amazing punishment for him. Once a year, he wanted Titus Oates to be brought through the streets of London and whipped. I'm sorry, I think that is a great punishment. Sadly, William and Mary ended that one. I personally, for what he did, for the lives that were caused, things could have been much worse for him, but they weren't. It's important to note that when we're talking about crime and punishment in this era, we're not talking like we're going to sit before a police officer and later on we're going to be interrogated, we're going to have a fair trial. Many times you'd be pressed Pressed being, you would literally be pressed with rocks, boards. If you confessed, you would lose all of your rights, your family's land rights. So if you died during torture, your family could still, your name would be intact. If you were executed as a admitted criminal, family wouldn't see any of it. The last few years of his reign were fairly turbulent, with basically it was back to religious turmoil. Charles II led a very hedonistic lifestyle. He drank a lot. He went to the theater regularly. He had plenty of liaisons with members of the theater. It's no surprise that a lot of the symptoms which he was described as having correlate with kidney failure. To top it off, Charles II also dabbled a lot in alchemy. I mean, he was the one who brought Isaac Newton. Yes, I hope you know who Isaac Newton is. When we say alchemy, we're not talking about fantasy. We're talking about the foundations of modern chemistry at this point. Charles II dabbled in that. He had his own little chemistry set. He was alchemist set, same tools in this time period. He would dabble in that. And some think it might have been some of the chemicals, but we're talking about somebody who had a pretty healthy appreciation for alcohol. He had what could be described as a stroke brought on by would have been kidney failure. He lingered for a while his doctors used such things as hot glass, bloodletting, the tried and true method of pigeon droppings on the feet, and ground up human skull. Enemas. Yes, this was very much medicine that had been around since medieval times. It was not modern medicine. Modern medicine was emerging in this time period. The court doctors were not very well versed in it. Do not do any of this. It's not safe. James II allegedly brought in Father Huddleston, who had helped Charles II escape. James II allegedly said, "Sire, I bring you a man who once saved your life, and now he'll save your soul." How coherent was Charles II at this time, we do not know, but allegedly he converted to Catholicism on his deathbed. Charles II said to James, "Be well to Portsmouth, and let not poor Nelly starve." Nell Gwyn being one of his lovers. Then to his courtiers, he said, "I am sorry, gentlemen, for being such a time a-dying." February 6th, 1685, Charles II died at Whitehall Palace. He left behind at least 13 illegitimate children, and his Catholic brother as King of England. He was later overthrown in the Glorious Revolution, which saw his nephew and his daughter, apologies there, take over as William and Mary. William and Mary did not have any legitimate heirs. James' other daughter, Anne, would take over. In 1707, Queen Anne signed the Act of Union, which officially made Scotland and England one nation, with one ruler. Earlier, in 1703, it was decided that Sophia, the Electress of Hanover, who was the granddaughter, I want to say, I will mark if I'm wrong, was the granddaughter of Elizabeth Stuart, daughter of James I. 28th of May, 1714, Sophia died. And when Anne died, Sophia's son, George I of House Hanover, took over. The Hanoverian line would continue until the children of Victoria and Albert. Albert was part of the Saxe-Coburg-Gotha. I know I pronounced this wrong. I apologize to any of my German viewers. My German is terrible. With hostilities in the 20th century become House Windsor. The story doesn't end quite yet. The first wife of now King Charles III. Her name was Diana. She was descended from the Duke of Grafton and the Duke of Richmond, who were illegitimate children of Charles II. William, Prince of Wales, will likely be the first king since James II, who is directly descended from the original line. I say king because Camilla is also a descendant of the Duke of Richmond. The Duke of Grafton was Henry Fitzroy. He was the son of the liaison with Barbara Palmer. Charles Lennox was the Duke of Richmond, and he was the son resulting from the liaison with the Duchess of Portsmouth. It's important to understand that history does not occur in a vacuum. The reign of Charles II changed the way England was seen by the rest of the world, good or bad. The England that produced art, the England that produced pirates, the England that would go on to colonize and to a certain extent persecute the rest of the world, came from this moment. Throughout a lot of popular English history, the Stuarts tend to be villainized, downplayed, in favor of the Tudors, the later Hanoverians. The Stuarts helped modernize England as we know it today. And it's important not to forget their contributions. It's also important to remember that they might not have always been such great people. History, one thing you learn about history the most, people are imperfect. We don't have perfection in history. Let that be a lesson to you in your day-to-day life. You do not have to be perfect. Just, please bring on somebody like Wren or Newton if you're going to do bad things, please. I'm sure some of you wanted to see me wear the wig one last time. There you go. Still hate it. Take care. Have an awesome day. If you enjoyed this video, like, subscribe, share it with your friends. Get more people to subscribe. Take care.